Afternoon, Ben.
Hello.
Thank you very much for sending your slides through again. It looks like we've had some interesting stuff this month.
Yep.
I will hand straight over to you to start and chat through what you've seen.
Super. So the contents on the first page are that we've got two things that are acute and of the moment, which is a spike in some seasonal diseases, slightly earlier than we would expect. One is lungworm in cattle, and two is Haemonchus in sheep. And then secondly is a couple of cases which sort of lead us on to discussion about the future and how to sort of make sure your sheep are as immune as possible to the things they're going to need to be immune to. And then a quick observation about herbal lays, which people may be thinking about turning lambs onto after weaning. So this first slide is hot off the press, and here is a video of some lungs that I saw yesterday, which comprises the first case of lungworm this year. So sorry about the shaky video. Here are the lungs. This is an adult cow out at grass, recently bought in, as it happens. There's the lungworm there. As you can see, they're no longer alive, but there's no doubt that they're there. There's some swelling in the lungs. There's some overinflation of the lungs because the airways have been damaged. And there again is more lungworms piling out of the main stem bronchi and the airways, coming up and causing those cattle to cough. So the story here, as we say on the next slide, is that this is a farm with fairly heavily stocked cattle farm. 3 cows with calves at foot were brought in on the 18th of May via a mart. Everything was okay until around a few weeks later when they started coughing and presented with a bit of malaise and upset. One of these cows with calves at foot died on the 15th of June, and this one, which I've just showed you the video of, died yesterday on the 3rd of July. All the cows, the remaining cow and the 3 calves are still coughing, so they are to be wormed. The interesting thing is when they were first seen coughing, they were given some antibiotics, just normal pneumonia, that sort of thing. The moral of the story being never ignore cows coughing, cows and calves, beef, sturks, coughing at grass. It is lungworm until proven otherwise. The other thing I think that this story demonstrates is that immunity is really important. And a lot of farms can have no clinical signs with lungworm because the cows are immune, and they acquire that immunity through trickle exposure, which leads them to perhaps a little bit of growth check or coughing, which you wouldn't notice, but then they're immune thereafter and keep getting topped up. If you introduce some cows that haven't seen lungworm recently, perhaps they've been housed for most of their lives or haven't been out much, or they're not very densely stocked, then you put them onto a heavily stocked cattle farm, you can get outbreaks. Same goes a little bit with if heifers are away somewhere else and then they come back onto the main farm, there can be an immunity gap. So immunity for lungworm is pretty strong, but not reliable if you don't know. And you can do blood samples and things if you want to assess the levels of immunity. And of course, vaccination is always an option. These cows will get treated probably with a pour on ivermectin. And just to remind you, we said before, Matt, on these discussions that there is increasing evidence that ivermectin, there may be some resistance to ivermectin in lungworms out there in the field. So it is worth making sure.
I was going to say, worth checking your treatment has been effective.
That the drugs worked.
And how would you check that, Ben?
There is a claim, I think you have to read the data sheet quite carefully. There is a claim on the data sheet for a little bit of persistence, I think, for ivermectin with lungworm. So you have to read the data sheet. I think it might be persistent for something like, I can't remember. Can you remember? Anyway, it's
about 14 days, I think.
Yeah, 14 days. As soon as those 14 days have arrived, plus a pre-patent period, sorry, when those 14 days have expired, just be careful. But the best thing to do probably is to do an egg count or a Behrman's test, which is a dung sample, probably 2 weeks after they've been treated, because if the worms are resistant, then there will obviously not be a persistency in any case. So I think probably the best test is a dung sample, with the caveat that they can be quite insensitive, but certainly if any die after treatment and I would submit those to post-mortem or get somebody to look at them, because if you have live lungworms after treatment at the right interval with ivermectin, that's strongly suggestive of
resistance. Yeah.
Resistance. And just to remind everyone, they are doing a project about this in the Moor Dun, so that's worth getting into contact with, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So lungworm. Earlier in the year than you would expect, wouldn't you think, Matt? So that proves that there must have been active lungworm on that pasture. They don't really overwinter on the pasture, do they, as eggs? They overwinter, I think, in a small number of adults, and they're born not as eggs, but as live larvae ready to go. So things can change quite quickly.
Yeah, and just when you're doing your dung samples, it's always worth sampling, several animals, because the bearmen, you're looking for larvae in the dung, and it's quite difficult. So it's easy to miss them. Best to do several samples, and then you pick them up if they're there.
And I think it relies on them being alive, so they have to swim up through the fluid during the test. So the sooner you can get them to the lab, the better.
Yeah, fresh samples, same day, really. Excellent.
So lungworm has arrived. There will be lungworms on the pastures out there, so never ignore coughing cattle. Right. Next one is another disease that has appeared probably more or earlier than one would expect, which is Haemonchus. And in the first, I've had 4 cases in the last 2 weeks, and I'll go through them one by one because they each demonstrate something. In the first case in Northumberland, who'd have thought it? Haemonchus in Northumberland. There was a spike in new mortality. The carcass I was sent was pale. You can see here the rumen on the right and the abomasum on the left, and you can see the dark contents in the abomasum. Haemonchus is really easy to check for because A, you see this with your own 2 eyes at post-mortem, and B, it is a phenomenal egg layer, so you get very high worm egg counts, which always in adult sheep, which should be immune to all the other worms, is a big flag. 55,200 eggs per gram, 91 of which were Haemonchus contortus. Those sheep were treated promptly with Zolvix and recovered well. But Northumberland is fairly north to be expecting cases of Haemonchus. So there we are. We must be on our guard. Case number 2, just a few days later, was in South Yorkshire. The interesting thing here was these sheep were given moxidectin at turnout. Every sheep in the flock was given moxidectin. Now, the merits of that have been well rehearsed. Merits or non-merits of doing that and risks of doing that have been well rehearsed. But that's what was done. At turnout stroke processing on the 15th of April, and the first case that I got with the first case that died was on the 12th of June, and I got this one on the 18th of June. You can see the abomasum here on the left, pale, dark contents and edematous, and the worm egg count was 62,150, of which 94% were Haemonchus contortus. Now, the question here, 2 questions really: is it resistance or reinfection, and is it overwintered larvae or in the abomasum hyperbiotic, or is it larvae on the pastures? Normally the assumption is small numbers of larvae overwinter in the abomasum, they populate the pastures, and then those have a couple of rounds of reproduction to create large numbers of challenge, like in this case to have killed this sheep. It's a bit difficult to say in this case, but more work would be suggested on this farm to do a formal fecal egg count reduction test with Haemonchus, of which a little bit more later, to establish are these Haemonchus worms resistant or sensitive to the ivermectin that was used as a blanket treatment at turnout. Would you agree, Matt? We should say that you should say that is risky for developing resistance, for promoting resistance, shouldn't we?
Blanket treatment of ewes at lambing time is well, we used to say that was a good idea. We now know it's not the best idea. You can get the same benefit from treating just the animals that need it. So, and that might be as few as 15 or 20% of the flock.
Yep, much better to be selective generally.
Yeah.
Okay. Case number 3 was some lambs in East Durham this time. So we've got all 4 corners of the northeast here. The story here was 800 lambs are outside, and the fella just got totally sick of the wet weather, which didn't really dry up until sort of the beginning to middle of June. He weaned them because they were born early, housed them all, and had reasonably eye-watering losses, 20 lambs dead over 5 days. When they came in for post-mortem, on the left here, you can see the abomasum full of bloody contents and lots of visible worms. And on the right here, you can see fibrinous pneumonia. That's just the pneumonia that had killed them. That's the secondary opportunistic disease. When we did a worm egg count, 84,400, and the Haemonchus percentages are weighted, but I wouldn't mind betting it's going to be high. Again, the interesting thing here was that these lambs were treated with a white drench 10 days before housing. So it is very likely in this case that you've got a benzimidazole resistant Haemonchus contortus, which was not killed by the white drench. And again, a very good reason here to do a fecal egg count reduction test, a formal fecal egg count reduction test with the interval correct for each wormer and worm species, and identify when you have resistance in these worms, because it can catch you out and bite you on the arse like it did with this bloke. Again, these were treated with Zolvix and have done very well since. But there it is, clear and present danger. Must have picked them up out at pasture. And then case 4, which was yesterday. This was the classic summer question of, have you seen much fluke this year? And I say no, it's the middle of summer. Normally fluke is, generally a winter thing, a wet winter thing. That's funny, because I've seen some ewes with pokes with, submandibular edema, bottle jaw, and they're looking a bit crap and pale. And I've lost, this bloke had lost 30. He has got a lot of sheep, but he'd lost 30 in the last 2 weeks with bottle jaw. Bottle jaw must be fluke. That's day 1 of farmer school. But in the summer, bottle jaw is not fluke. In the summer, bottle jaw is Haemonchus contortus. And here we had in adult mules a worm egg count of 35,000 eggs per gram, Haemonchus speciation awaited. But you look at that picture, see how pale the liver is, and see how all those dark contents of that abomasum, that is going to be full of Haemonchus. So those will get treated with Zolvix or Closantel or something like that, and they should make a full recovery. But that farm now is categorized as Haemonchus positive, and we'll need to bear that in mind in future. So there we have it. 4 cases in 2 weeks. Haemonchus is out there. Why it's earlier this year, the scholars will argue, but there it is. I'm just here to report. We can speculate at our leisure.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to work out why it hasn't been particularly warm. Maybe we didn't have a particularly cold winter, so maybe we've had more eggs surviving on pasture over winter.
Yes.
Who knows? But again, you say earlier than normal, and a good watch out for people that might think they've got a bit of fluke in their ewes. Yeah. Yes,
we need a reprogramming of our first thought when we see bottle jaw in the summer. Yes,
absolutely.
Good. And then, of course, Haemonchus in the southern hemisphere is very resistant. Went to a talk recently that said levamisole might be slightly better, but that's probably because levamisole doesn't affect the encysted larvae, and so there is no competitive advantage for being resistant to levamisole or not being resistant to levamisole, and if you're encysted, because the resistant and the sensitive ones survive because it doesn't kill any of them, resistant or not. So anyway, the only way to tell is a fecal egg count reduction test. And here is a reminder quickly, sorry to sound like a broken record, are the intervals: 14 days for a white drench, 7 days for a yellow drench, and 14 days for a clear drench. There you are. Only 2 numbers you have to remember. Good. So the next interesting case we had was some pet lambs. Everybody hates pet lambs, but this year they're worth a few quid. So people have been keeping them. These lambs had 20, 30 quid's worth of milk replacer spent on them, bedding, housing, time, all that sort of stuff. They got to a stage where they were ready to go outside. They've been treated, listen to this, they've been treated with a coccidiostat 2 weeks before they went out, right? They went outside, 50 of them, looked crap, died within about 6 days, started scouring. The coccidial oocyst count was low and the egg count was 0. On gut histopathology, so we thought, what's going on here? On gut histopathology, there was severe coccidiosis. So 2 things here. One is, in that case, the coccidial oocyst count was an underestimate of the coccidial burden because, it was a pre-patent infection. Secondly, these lambs must have went out into a tidal wave of oocysts on dirty sheep pasture. And thirdly, histopathology was useful for the diagnosis and the only way you would have made it. The last thing to say is that pet lambs are immunologically naive because they may well not have met any cocci where they were before. Nice clean bedding, not many of them, sparsely stocked, they might not have met any. And to be immune to cocci, you have to meet it. Not something that happens automatically with age. You have to meet it and become immune. So I think bear that in mind where you're putting your pet lambs out, if you put them out at all, isn't it? There may be a case of keeping them in forevermore, because although grazed grass is cheap, grazed grass with lots of parasites in is not that cheap if they die. So this immunological status of animals always wants to be considered. This is a bit of a theme of this talk today, isn't it? Whenever you're putting animals anywhere, think to yourself, are they immunologically equipped to go where they're going? If that makes sense.
Yeah, and we always say pet lambs or young lambs, anything getting turned out for the first time should be onto the cleanest bit of ground that you've got. And just because you've got some fresh grass there doesn't mean it's clean.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it has to be stuff that hasn't had, especially lambs on previously. Yeah,
but longer than you would think. Yes. And the last on the subject of other immunologically naive animals, just thinking ahead to weaning time, these hill weather lambs that come down from the fells are immunologically naive. They haven't seen much of the world at all, and you see it all the time. These lambs get annihilated sometimes when they come onto in-by pastures, which are often very sheep sick, especially by that time of the year in late July, August, where they've had sheep on them all the way through. The worms have overwintered and hatched and built up and built up and built up, and suddenly these lads walk into a tidal wave of hatching worms and coccidia as well. No point worming them before you turn them out onto those pastures or giving them a coccidiostat. You have to worm them or give them a coccidiostat when the worms and cocci are in them. So that may mean turning them out and then giving them a coccidiostat or a worm a week later or so, when the worms are actually in them. Or alternatively, housing them, the wethers, who don't never need to be immune to worms. If you house them and finish them inside, that's better for them because they never need to be immune. The gimmers are slightly different. They will need to be immune, but you'll have to manage them acquiring that immunity carefully, I think.
Or, these are like lambs, aren't they, going out for the first time? They need to be on your lowest risk pasture. So if you want to get them finished in a way quickly, onto some silage aftermath.
Herbal lays inside, something like that. Give some thought. And the last thing to give some thought to, with weaning on the horizon, is I think this every year. One thing you can do that costs you nothing is to improve the selection of your females. Now, some people buy in replacement females, some people breed their own, and I think if you want to select these replacement females properly, because they're important, they're going to do you a job for the next 5-6 years. It is a good idea to individually select them, and what an opportunity it is to stick a tag in their ear at weaning or before, measure their growth rates with your magic wand, and decide for yourself which of those do I want to keep. Now, if you're breeding if you're breeding ewe lambs, they're going to have to grow fast, whatever they do, to be big enough at breeding time to actually breed and go to the top and be big enough to do a job. So you're sort of limited in that case. But if you're breeding them as shearlings, you've got some time to decide, do I want the ones that are going to break records for growing fast? Because they may be the ones who aren't as immune to worms, because you've got a partition of your energy. Some lambs will partition their energy towards growing fast, and some will partition their energy and protein towards being immune to worms. And in some lambs you can have both, but generally speaking, it's one or the other. So if you're breeding your sheep as shearlings, you may have the luxury of not having to select the fastest growing ones, and you may find that the fastest growing ones are not the ones who are most immune to worms. So if you segregate your lambs at weaning and put tags in the ones you're interested in, the females, put your fat lambs on some clean pasture and get them away, worm them, whatever it takes to get them away, doesn't matter. But the female ones, you might want to consider carefully challenging those on some dirty pasture and see which ones grow the fastest, because they will need to acquire some worm resilience. By resistance, I don't mean wormer resistance. I mean the sheep are resistant to growth rate suffering if they get worms. So you may want careful.
We'll call it immunity. Immunity to worms,
immunity.
and then resilience to cope with them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Immunity to worms. And it may not be that difficult if you put some tags in to figure out in your own head which of these female lambs are better at growing in the face of a worm challenge. Does that make sense? Not going to cost you a fortune, might actually make you some money in the longer term.
Absolutely. And you've got to stick an EID tag in them at some point, so you might as well get some benefit from it.
You're spending that pound, get more bang for the buck. So have a think in advance of weaning, if there's anything useful you can do then. And the last thing to say is that now, again, in advance of these lambs going on to herbal lays post-weaning, some of them will get twisted guts and die, because you have a herbal lay like that, it's going to grow like stink, lots of soluble carbohydrates straight into the rumen. All those bacteria in the gut are going to have a pub crawl, produce a lot of gas from fermentation of that carbohydrate. Some of them will have twisted guts. Now, it's a difficult thing to present, there's no two ways about it, and the growth rates in the rest may compensate for a few deaths, which is probably okay. Some tips I would suggest, and you will know as much about this as me, is that always allow some run back to stalky plant material if possible, or leave some of the edges unclipped, because they do say that lambs will seek out long fibre to get them ruminating and to get them producing saliva to break down and to better absorb some of this carbohydrate in the rumen rather than in the hindgut. That will all help with that, and they will seek it out apparently if they need it. That's one thing. Also, strip graze them if you can, but it is a pain in the arse, there's no two ways about it. And broad spectrum clostridial cover may help in some cases if there's a degree of clostridial enteritis, type A enteritis. Just saying, think ahead, and if there are any of those things you can do that require a bit of forward planning, then a bit of forward planning might save you a few dead lambs. And when lambs are the price they are, that may be worthwhile, I would say. So,
yeah, very sensible.
In summary, I think we've got consider immunity and plan ahead.
Excellent. That's very interesting, Ben. Thank you very much for that. The watch out on lungworm and Haemonchus for sheep is something we need to take note of, definitely.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you next time.
Are you gonna join us at Malvern next time?
Yes, we'll be at Malvern. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Excellent. We'll see you there.
Yes.